Namaskar. In today's edition of Right Angle, I'll be discussing something very important that our Prime Minister said at a public function in Madhya Pradesh yesterday. He talked of the evil practice of triple talaq and the desirability of the coming of uniform civil laws in the country for all. As you know, last week the 22nd Law Commission of India had sought fresh suggestions from various stakeholders, including public and religious organizations, on the Uniform Civil Code. In fact, various high courts as well as the Supreme Court of India have asked this question many a time in recent years as to why the country is not having a uniform civil code. And also it should be remembered that against that background, the Modi government had asked the Law Commission, I think it was sometime in 2016, to examine the viability of implementing a uniform civil code in the country, based on what the government then said was the best elements from various existing personal codes. And if I remember that time, and it was quite predictable, the Congress party had questioned the decision, particularly its timing, just ahead of the assembly elections in Uttar Pradesh. And also the vocal sections of the Muslims had also challenged this decision of the government of asking the Law Commission to find out a way. The legal merits for the desirability of a uniform civil code for every Indian, irrespective of his or her religious identity, are unquestionable. In fact, it is one of the directives to the government that is enshrined in our Constitution of India, that is Article 44. And this directive does not come in conflict with Article 25 of the Constitution of India, which guarantees the freedom of religion, because there the clause 2 of Article 25 clearly says that separates religion from the secular laws, that removes what it says, some regressive religious practices. It clearly states that freedom of religion shall not limit the state from making any law providing for social welfare and reform. And then, of course, we have also Article 14 of the Constitution, under which every Indian has equal right. No one under this doctrine of equality can be discriminated in the name of background, caste, creed or religion. Actually, though some people question this concept of uniform civil code, but I think that is a misnomer, because uniform civil laws will disallow, it will not disallow rather any person marrying according to his or her own religion. What it does basically is that it ensures uniform rights to all in marriage, divorce, property rights and inheritance in a society that is essentially patriarchal. And in fact, yesterday Prime Minister made it very clear in his meeting that the Uniform Civil Code actually is going to help the Muslim women, Muslim mothers, Muslim sisters, Muslim daughters, because as Prime Minister said, triple talaq is not even applicable or allowed in Muslim countries like Pakistan. And why this unnecessary controversy and hesitation or opposition to that in India? Actually, in that sense, the common civil code is a gender sensitive. It has nothing to do with religion. Actually, it is gender sensitive in the sense that it is very pro-women. However, it is the lack of political consensus in our country that has led to the absence of uniform civil laws. Political parties, particularly those who claim to be secular, are afraid that any move towards having common civil laws will disturb the minorities who constitute their biggest vote bank. They do not realize that by arguing against uniform civil code, they are indulging in perhaps one of the worst communal practices that one can think of. It is to be noted that apart from Muslims, all other religions in India have undergone some social reforms or the other in their personal laws and practices. The Christians, for instance, have had Indian Christian Marriage Act 1872. Then they had another called Indian Divorce Act in 1869 and the Indian Succession Act in 1925. But in 1983, initiatives were taken by bishops, clergy, lawyers and social activists to modernize several sections of these laws that were considered discriminatory. Similarly, the Parsis also have undertaken some exercise and they have amended their Marriage and Divorce Act. I think that was in 1936. And as you know, the Hindu civil laws that apply also to the Sikhs, Buddhists, and the Jains have been codified many times in our parliament. The most important being the Hindu Marriage Act of 1955, then you had the Hindu Succession Act 1956, then you had Hindu Minority and Guardianship Act 1956, and Hindu Adoption and Maintenance Act again in 1956. But in contrast to these reforms in other religions, the Muslim personal law has always remained unchanged over the centuries. It is derived mainly from Quran and what they call Hadith. The Quran is the main source of the Islamic laws, but it is to be noted that the Muslim personal law, as is known and practiced today, was compiled more than 100 years after the death of the Prophet. But be that as it may, the fact remains that the Muslim leaders in our country, and particularly the All India Personal Law Board, which is called AIMPLB, and remember, it is not an elective body, it is a private organization, and they claim that they represent all the Muslims in India. Nothing can be more laughable or ludicrous than this. A private organization claiming to represent all the Muslims, that is that Muslim Law Board. But it really has always taken the leadership in opposing and have resented whenever the Supreme Court makes a negative remark on the triple talaq and practices the poor maintenance of divorced Muslim women. And this board says that the country's top court, mark my word, they say the country's top court has no jurisdiction to undertake the exercise, as the community's personal law was based on the Quran and not on a law enacted by human beings or by parliament. In fact, drawing a line between a law enacted by the legislature and social norm dictated by religion, the AIMPLB has told the Supreme Court, and here I may quote, the Muhammadan law is founded on the Holy Quran and the what they call hadith of the Prophet of Islam, and this cannot fall within the purview of the expression of laws in force as mentioned in the Article 13 of the Constitution, and that the personal law of Muslim has been passed or made by a legislation. Only Muslim personal law is inextricably interwoven with the religion of Islam. And what is there in that religion? No parliament, no Supreme Court does have any authority to interfere in that. Can you believe this? And this is the logic that they give. But actually what they have done, this Uniform Civil Code actually just law towards the social reforms. But the Muslims, and particularly these so-called self-appointed leaders, they make it a religious issue and say that it is beyond the purview of man-made laws. And they also say that it is deeply flawed. It is true that except, of course, if you take examples of other countries, I think except Bangladesh and Indonesia, every Islamic country has a uniform law based on Sharia, which applies even to the non-Muslims. But it is also true that in virtually all other countries where Muslims live in numbers, significant numbers, there is a uniform law, both civil and criminal. For instance, if the Muslims living in the United States or France or in Britain or anywhere can be regulated by man-made uniform laws and yet remain proud Muslims, why should AIMPLB fear that Indian Muslims will cease to be Muslims once they come under the uniform civil law? That this argument is all the more redundant when the same Indian Muslims are under the purview of the man-made criminal law. You say, for instance, that the laws as made by Prophet cannot be challenged or cannot be changed by human beings. But the point is, if that is the case, how the Muslims in India come under the Indian criminal law? And that is not based on Sharia, as is the case in many Islamic countries. How come Sharia is sacrosanct only for civil laws, but not for criminal laws? And you will be surprised. I think you should note it, not a question of surprise, because it's a fact. Even in our Goa, that state, Goa practices a common civil code, which has been the law since 1869, when the state was under the Portuguese colonial rule. And of course, there are some flexibilities, here and there. But the point is that there is one civil law for all the people living in Goa, and all the Indians really do observe this principle of one civil law. All Indian, and it applies to all Indian citizens living in Goa. And the Muslims there in Goa are also quite comfortable with it. In fact, when in 1981, some Orthodox Muslims under the banner of Goa Muslim Sharia organization, and in fact, that was supported by Muslim leaders outside Goa, particularly in the neighboring Kerala, Karnataka, and they tried to apply that the law of India to Goa, that would have been, Muslims, Goan Muslims will be out of the Goa's common uniform law, civil uniform law. But that time, and it is remarkable that the Muslims of Goa, they opposed this interference by the Muslims from other states. In fact, they opposed this thing, and who were the people at front? The Goan Muslim youth groups and Goa's women associations, they all resisted that interference. So the point is, if that is the case, if Muslims of Goa can have a UCC, then should we say that Muslims of Goa are lesser Muslims than their counterparts in other states like Uttar Pradesh or Karnataka or Kerala? It is often argued actually that the Muslim community itself will generate a process of change and reform in the course of time. Of course, it is very well to argue that. But the point is, what is the reality? There is not much hope. As we have already seen, there are, reforms in other, laws, but here for the Muslims, there are no systematic attempts to improve that. And so my point is that as an argument there are merits in it, but if one goes by the reality on the ground, there is not much hope. As we have already seen, there have been, again I am repeating it again, that there are simply no reforms in Muslim personal practices over the last 100 years. If anything, actually the situation has worsened for gender equity and justice among the Muslims in recent years. Wahhabism with enormous Saudi petrodollars, of course this trend now has come rather lessened because of the new leadership there in Saudi Arabia, which is trying to reform, but that's a different matter. But the point is, now we see that this, instead of undertaking or welcoming social reforms, how regressive ideas are being injected into the minds of our Indian Muslims. See, in states like Jammu and Kashmir, Kerala and Telangana, how the great culture of Sufism, which is the liberalist Islam in the subcontinent, has been badly challenged by Wahhabi outfits that are segregating boys and girls in the madrasas, insisting only on the teaching of Sharia law in the madrasas, compelling girls to wear Islamic clothes, including the hijab, and promoting rapid changes in the eating culture in places like Kashmir. You should be knowing this, that before 90s, hardly any Kashmiri ate beef. But now that beef eating is being systematically promoted there. But anyway, that's a different point. So my point is that when one comes to the UCC, what is the way out? In the prevailing political atmosphere of the country, it is very difficult to legislate for a uniform, civil, code. In fact, earlier on this topic, I was always of the belief that this is something which the Supreme Court can do, the apex court can do, like they have done in some other cases when legislators fail, then they, through their judicial verdicts, announce or promulgate some things that become the laws of the country. And in this, when Supreme Court itself has pointed out so many times the need for India having a uniform civil code, what prevents it from doing. But now I think after the coming of this Modi regime, or particularly Prime Minister, I am now increasingly of the belief that if he wants, it can be done. If something which was unthinkable, he abrogated Article 370 and brought the Kashmiris to the mainstream of India, something which was unthinkable before, I am quite sure Modi, if he so wishes, can really pass this legislation in the coming days in our parliament. Thank you.